Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The Blue Ridge Mountains of Western Virginia hold many stories within their ancient ridges. This particular account takes place in McDowell County, near the coal mining settlements that dotted the rugged landscape in the early 1900s. Local newspapers from 1904 through 1968 make brief mentions of this case, though official records remain sparse. What we present today is based on county archives, personal correspondence, and oral histories collected by Professor Elias Thornton of Roanoke College in 1962, before his research was mysteriously discontinued. In the autumn of 1904, the town of Welch was experiencing prosperity from the Norfolk and Western Railway that had connected their isolated community to the wider world. Coal was being extracted from the mountains at an unprecedented rate, bringing wealth to some and backbreaking labor to many. But beyond the settlements, deep in the hollows where the sun barely reached the forest floor, people still lived as they had for generations, isolated, self-sufficient, and wary of outsiders. The area miners called Black Wolf Ridge stood 6 miles north of Welch, named for a particularly dark outcropping of stone that resembled a wolf's head when viewed from the valley below. A narrow trail wound through dense forest to reach the ridge, used mainly by hunters and the occasional prospector. According to the McDowell County Register, most locals gave the area a wide berth, considering it unusually difficult terrain with little of value to offer. It was here that Thomas Alderson made his home. County tax records from 1898 show Alderson claiming a small plot of land near the ridge. He paid his modest taxes in person each year, with silver coins that the clerk noted were worn smooth, as if carried for many years. Alderson was what locals called a ridge runner or mountain man, someone who lived entirely off the land, avoiding the towns except when absolutely necessary. Dr. Samuel Phillips, the county physician, described Alderson in his journal as a man of approximately 50 years, though weather-beaten appearance suggests greater age. Tall and lean, with a beard reaching mid-chest, often unkempt. Speaks little, but with educated diction, inconsistent with his rustic appearance. This curious contradiction would later become significant. The doctor had treated Alderson once in 1902 for a deep laceration to his left arm, noting that the man refused laudanum for pain and watched the procedure with unsettling intensity. Most residents of McDowell County considered Alderson an eccentric but harmless fixture of their community. He would appear in town perhaps once every 2 months, trading pelts and occasionally wild herbs at Hammond's General Store. The store ledger, preserved in the County Historical Society, shows Alderson primarily purchased salt, coffee, ammunition, and, curiously, large quantities of lye soap. He never bought foodstuffs, apparently providing his own sustenance from hunting and foraging. Marjorie Hammond, the storekeeper's wife, told Professor Thornton in her 1962 interview, "My father always said to be respectful but brief with Mr. Alderson. He wasn't one for conversation." The most peculiar thing was his cleanliness. For a man living alone in the woods, he was fastidious. His clothes were worn but scrubbed, and he smelled strongly of lye soap, his hands especially, red and raw from washing. This unusual attention to cleanliness would later take on a more sinister aspect, but in the early years of the century, it simply marked him as eccentric. The Hammonds and others who interacted with Alderson described him as unfailingly polite, if reserved. He was literate, signing his name in a flowing script on receipts and occasionally requesting newspapers, which he would read while sitting outside the store. Sheriff James Coleman's official reports mention Alderson only twice before 1904, once when registering his Winchester rifle, as required by local ordinance, and once when he reported finding a deceased hunter in the woods, apparently the victim of a falling accident. The sheriff noted that Alderson had taken appropriate measures with the body, bringing personal effects to town for the man's family while providing precise directions to the location for recovery. The incident that would forever change how Thomas Alderson was perceived in McDowell County occurred on October 12, 1904. According to weather reports from nearby Bluefield, the region had experienced unseasonable warmth followed by torrential rains, causing the Tug Fork River to swell dangerously. Many mining operations had temporarily ceased due to flooding. It was during this rainy period that two geological surveyors from the Eastern Mining Consortium, Walter Green and Frederick Powell, arrived in Welch. Their assignment, according to company records, was to assess potential new coal seams along Black Wolf Ridge. They took rooms at the Whitman boarding house, where the proprietress, Elizabeth Whitman, later recalled them as educated gentlemen from Pennsylvania, very eager about their work despite the poor weather. The surveyors hired a local guide, Joseph Miller, who knew the region well from hunting expeditions. Miller was initially reluctant to lead the men to Black Wolf Ridge, suggesting alternate locations with known coal deposits. When pressed for his hesitation, Miller reportedly told the men, "That's Alderson's territory. He don't take kindly to people mapping his mountain." Green and Powell, representing powerful Eastern business interests, were undeterred. They offered Miller additional payment, and he reluctantly agreed to take them as far as the base of the ridge, but insisted they should announce their presence to Alderson before proceeding further. The three men set out on the morning of October 15th, equipped with surveying instruments and provisions for 3 days. What happened next was pieced together from Joseph Miller's testimony, as recorded in Sheriff Coleman's report, dated October 18, 1904. Miller stated that they reached the base of Black Wolf Ridge by midday and made camp near a small stream. The rain had temporarily subsided, though the ground remained muddy and treacherous. The following morning, they began their ascent. Approximately 2 miles up the trail, they encountered Thomas Alderson. According to Miller, the mountain man appeared suddenly from the dense forest, rifle in hand but not raised. Miller performed introductions, explaining the surveyor's purpose. Alderson listened silently, then stated, "The upper ridge is dangerous after the rains, rock slides. You'd do better to return when the ground is firm." Green, described by Miller as impatient with delays, assured Alderson they would be careful and attempted to offer payment for access to the land. This apparently offended Alderson, who refused the money and simply turned away, disappearing into the forest. Miller recommended they heed the warning and return another time, but Green insisted on continuing. Powell, seemingly uneasy, sided with Green, and Miller reluctantly led them further up the ridge. By late afternoon, they had reached a relatively flat area where Green wished to take measurements. Miller described setting up camp while the surveyors worked. The weather had deteriorated again, with heavy mist reducing visibility. As darkness fell, Miller reported hearing movement in the surrounding forest, possibly deer or bear. The men built their fire higher and kept their rifles close. According to Miller's statement, he awoke before dawn to find both Green and Powell missing from the camp. Their bedrolls had been slept in, and their personal effects remained, but the men were gone. Miller called for them, receiving no response. After searching the immediate vicinity, he discovered footprints leading away from camp, not down the trail they had ascended, but deeper into the forest toward the summit of the ridge. Miller followed these tracks for approximately half a mile until they disappeared amid rocky ground. Concerned, Miller returned to camp, gathered essential supplies, and ascended to Welch to report the men missing. Sheriff Coleman organized a search party consisting of 7 men, including Miller, and 2 experienced hunters familiar with the ridge. They departed the following morning, October 18th. The official report filed by Sheriff Coleman on October 23rd provides a clinical but disturbing account of what the search party discovered. After retracing the route to the surveyor's camp, they followed Miller's directions to where he had lost the trail. One of the hunters, Benjamin Tucker, located scuff marks on a boulder that suggested someone had climbed to a narrow ledge above. This ledge revealed a crevice in the rock face approximately 3 feet wide. Coleman's report states, upon examination, the crevice was found to extend approximately 12 feet into the mountain, widening into a small natural chamber. Within this chamber were found the personal effects of Mr. Green and Mr. Powell, including their pocket watches, wallets, and surveying equipment. Blood evidence was present on the stone floor. No human remains were immediately visible. The search party widened their efforts, combing the surrounding forest for any sign of the missing men. It was Tucker who made the next discovery approximately 400 yards from the crevice, a carefully constructed fire pit that, according to Coleman, showed evidence of recent and intense use, with ash deposits suggesting multiple long-burning fires. Near this fire pit, partially concealed by recently disturbed earth and leaf litter, they found a collection of bones. Coleman, exhibiting restraint typical of official documents of the era, described them as appearing to be of human origin, scraped unusually clean with evidence of tool marks on several larger specimens. He noted that the remains were insufficient to constitute 2 complete human frames, suggesting portions may have been removed from the site. The search party immediately suspected Thomas Alderson's involvement and redirected their efforts toward locating his cabin. Miller knew the approximate location but had never visited the dwelling. After several hours of searching, they found a small clearing containing a well-maintained log cabin with a stone foundation. Coleman described the scene. The dwelling showed signs of recent occupation but was currently vacant. A garden plot contained medicinal herbs and root vegetables. The interior was unusually orderly for a bachelor's residence in such isolated circumstances. Coleman's report contains a detailed inventory of the cabin's contents. Of particular note were numerous books on anatomy and medical practice, some dating to the previous century, a collection of surgical implements maintained in excellent condition, and a set of journals bound in leather containing entries in a precise hand dating back approximately 15 years. The contents of these journals were not included in Coleman's official report, but Professor Thornton's research uncovered portions through interviews with the search party members. According to Tucker, who glimpsed several pages before Coleman secured the journals as evidence, they contained detailed observations of human anatomy written in a clinical manner, as if from a physician's study. Another search party member, William Harland, recalled seeing drawings of human musculature rendered with unsettling precision. While the search party was examining the cabin, Thomas Alderson returned. Coleman's report describes the encounter. Subject approached openly, making no attempt at concealment. When questioned regarding the missing surveyors, he initially denied knowledge of their fate after warning them of dangerous conditions. When informed of the evidence discovered, subject fell silent for approximately 2 minutes before stating, "They wouldn't listen." No one ever listens until it's too late. Alderson was taken into custody without resistance and transported to the jail in Welch. Coleman noted that even after the arduous journey down the mountain and the serious accusations against him, Alderson maintained a composed demeanor, requesting only water to wash his hands before being placed in a cell. The subsequent investigation revealed details that transformed Thomas Alderson from an eccentric mountain dweller into a figure of profound disquiet in the community's consciousness. County records showed no birth certificate or previous residence for any Thomas Alderson in McDowell County or surrounding areas. His sudden appearance in the region approximately 15 years earlier had gone largely unquestioned in the transient atmosphere of a growing mining community. A significant discovery came from Dr. Phillips, who recalled treating Alderson for his arm injury. Upon reviewing his medical reference books, the doctor found an uncanny similarity between Alderson's handwriting in signing his name and illustrations in a rare medical text published in Philadelphia in 1882. This text, Comprehensive Studies in Human Anatomy, was authored by a Dr. Thomas Alden, who had been a professor at Jefferson Medical College until his abrupt disappearance in 1889, following accusations of unethical research practices. A telegram to authorities in Philadelphia, preserved in the case file, confirmed that the physical description of Thomas Alderson matched that of the missing Dr. Alden. Further correspondence revealed that Alden had been under investigation for the disappearance of several indigent patients from the hospital where he practiced, though no charges had ever been filed due to insufficient evidence. The journals found in Alderson's cabin provided the most disturbing insights. According to testimony given at the preliminary hearing by Sheriff Coleman, the writings detailed Alderson's systematic study of human anatomy through direct observation, a clinical euphemism for what appeared to be the methodical dissection of numerous individuals over many years. The journals revealed that Alden had fled Philadelphia after coming under suspicion, traveling west, and ultimately finding the isolation he desired in the Appalachian Mountains. He initially sustained his anatomical studies using animal specimens, but according to Coleman's testimony, the subject repeatedly expressed frustration with the limitations of comparative anatomy and returned to human subjects when opportunity presented. The most chilling aspect of the journals was their tone, entirely clinical and detached, describing human dissection with the same dispassionate observation one might use to categorize plant specimens. Coleman testified that Alderson showed particular interest in the structural differences between individuals of varying physical development, noting that his preferred subjects were those with pronounced musculature developed through physical labor. This preference explained his targeting of the surveyors, men who were physically fit from their work in rough terrain. According to the journals, Alderson had observed Green and Powell from a distance after their encounter on the trail. When they made camp, he approached during the night, offering them tea, which was apparently drugged. In his journal, he described this as providing assistance to weary travelers, a disturbing rationalization that suggested a mind unable to recognize the horror of its actions. The journals indicated that previous victims had included lone hunters and prospectors, individuals whose disappearances in the dangerous mountain terrain would raise little alarm. Alderson was methodical in disposing of evidence, using fire to reduce most remains and scattering others deep in the forest, where they would be consumed by scavengers. The preliminary hearing was closed to the public due to the disturbing nature of the evidence, but newspaper accounts from the Welch Daily News indicate that Alderson sat completely still throughout the proceedings, speaking only to correct a minor detail regarding the specific medical text he had authored. The judge ordered Alderson held without bail to await trial. What happened next remains somewhat unclear in the historical record. According to the sheriff's daily log, on the night of November 2, 1904, a group of approximately 20 men gathered outside the Welch jailhouse. No names were recorded, but they were described as miners and associates of the search party. The log notes that the sheriff advised the men to disperse, but was overwhelmed by superior numbers. The single deputy on duty reported being locked in a storage room, while the men took the keys to the cells. The official inquest concluded that Thomas Alderson was removed from his cell by the group and taken to an unknown location. His body was discovered the following morning, hanging from a sycamore tree near the Tug Fork River. The county coroner recorded the cause of death as asphyxiation by hanging and listed the manner as suicide by person or persons in temporary derangement of mind, a common euphemism in that era for lynching when authorities had no intention of pursuing the perpetrators. What makes this case particularly unusual is what happened after Alderson's death. According to Professor Thornton's interviews conducted in 1962, the men who carried out the lynching reported something unexpected. One participant, speaking anonymously due to his advanced age and the statute of limitations having expired, told Thornton, "When we went to take him from the cell, he didn't fight us. He just looked at each man, one by one, like he was memorizing our faces. Then he said, 'This work is always the same, just different tools.' None of us knew what he meant by that. Another elderly resident recalled that when they reached the hanging tree, Alderson asked for a moment to wash his hands in the river. Something about the request unsettled the men, Thornton's interview notes state, but they allowed it out of some strange compulsion. He knelt by the water, methodically cleaning his hands while humming quietly. Several men reported feeling a powerful urge to leave, but none did. Following Alderson's death, Sheriff Coleman and Dr. Phillips returned to the cabin on Black Wolf Ridge to collect remaining evidence. The sheriff's report indicates they found previously overlooked documentation suggesting Alderson had conducted some form of anatomical research on himself. Diagrams showed detailed self-observation of the nervous system, with margins noting increased sensitivity following stimulation technique. The report mentions evidence of self-surgery, including a partially healed incision on the subject's left forearm, apparently self-administered and sutured. The cabin and its contents were burned by order of the county judge, who determined that the materials had no scientific value and could only serve to distress the community further. The ashes were buried and no marker was placed on the site. Thomas Alderson was interred in an unmarked grave on unconsecrated ground at the edge of the Welch Cemetery. The case might have faded entirely from memory were it not for a series of unusual incidents in the years that followed. In 1906, Benjamin Tucker, who had discovered the crevice containing the surveyor's belongings, was found dead in his home. The coroner determined he had died of apparent heart failure, though he was only 38 and previously healthy. Dr. Phillips noted in his personal journal, not in the official record, that Tucker's expression showed evidence of extreme terror, and his hands were clasped as if in desperate prayer. William Harland, another member of the search party, reportedly began experiencing vivid nightmares in which he was being methodically dissected while fully conscious. His wife told neighbors that he would wake screaming, clutching at his chest and arms as if feeling phantom incisions. In 1908, Harland was committed to the Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, where records indicate he was treated for acute melancholia with paranoid features. He died there in 1911, having never recovered. By 1915, 6 of the 7 men who had discovered Alderson's cabin had died under circumstances that local residents found troubling, if not overtly suspicious. Only Joseph Miller survived, having left the region immediately after the events of 1904 to resettle in Kentucky. When contacted by mail by a local historian in 1940, Miller reportedly sent back a single-line response: "Some things must not be remembered." Sheriff Coleman, who had led the investigation, suffered from progressive insomnia in the years following the case. His wife reported that he would check the doors and windows multiple times each night, claiming he could hear someone washing their hands in water that wasn't there. In 1909, Coleman resigned his position and moved his family to Richmond, where he worked as a night watchman until his death in 1920. Dr. Phillips continued his practice in Welch, but reportedly refused to perform autopsies or major surgeries after 1904. His journal entries from 1906 onward make repeated references to A's technique, apparently comparing his own medical procedures unfavorably to those he had witnessed in Alderson's journals. Phillips died in 1918 during the influenza epidemic, having continued to treat patients despite his own illness. The site of Alderson's cabin gradually acquired a reputation among local residents as a place to be avoided. Hunters reported unsettling experiences in the vicinity, including unexplained anatomical diagrams carved into tree trunks and the persistent smell of lye soap when no one was present. By 1920, Black Wolf Ridge had been abandoned even by the most experienced outdoorsmen in the region. The Eastern Mining Consortium, which had employed the murdered surveyors, attempted to develop the area in 1922, establishing a small mining operation on the ridge. Workers reported numerous accidents and equipment failures. Several men quit after claiming to find precisely arranged animal bones near their equipment. The operation was abandoned after less than 6 months, with company records citing unfavorable geological conditions rather than acknowledging the widespread unease among the workers. The most thorough investigation of the Alderson case was undertaken by Professor Elias Thornton beginning in 1960. A historian specializing in Appalachian folk beliefs and legends, Thornton initially believed the Alderson story was a cautionary tale that had grown from a more mundane incident. His research in county archives and interviews with elderly residents convinced him otherwise. Thornton's collected materials included transcripts of interviews, copies of official documents, and photographs of the few physical items that had survived, including Alderson's lye soap receipts from Hammond's store and a page reportedly torn from one of his journals before the rest were burned. In a letter to a colleague at the University of Virginia dated March 1962, Thornton wrote, "The most disturbing aspect of this case is not the acts themselves, horrific though they were, but the apparent transformation of a man of science into something beyond our understanding of human depravity." Alderson's journals suggest not a descent into madness, but rather a methodical exploration of boundaries that rational minds inherently recognize should not be crossed. Thornton's research came to an abrupt halt in November 1962. According to university records, he requested an indefinite leave of absence, citing health concerns requiring immediate attention. He did not return to his position, and attempts by colleagues to contact him were unsuccessful. His research materials were found neatly organized in his office, with a note requesting they be sealed for 50 years before being accessed again. A brief item in the Roanoke Times, dated December 3, 1962, reported that police had conducted a welfare check at Thornton's residence after neighbors reported not seeing him for several days. The article states only that no evidence of foul play was discovered and that Professor Thornton appears to have departed voluntarily, taking personal effects suggesting extended travel. He was never officially listed as a missing person, and no further information about his whereabouts was ever established. The sealed materials were placed in the university archives with instructions for their opening in 2012. However, according to archive records, a small fire of undetermined origin damaged that section of the archive in 1968. The materials were listed as unsalvageable and disposed of, effectively erasing the most comprehensive collection of information about the Alderson case. Today, little physical evidence remains of Thomas Alderson or the events that occurred on Black Wolf Ridge. The area was partially logged in the 1950s, and subsequent mining operations have altered the landscape significantly. Local residents still regard certain sections of the ridge with unease, particularly the area where Alderson's cabin reportedly stood, though its exact location has been lost to time. The grave of Thomas Alderson remains unmarked in the old section of Welch Cemetery. Caretaker records indicate that despite the absence of a headstone, the grave occasionally receives unusual visitations. A longtime groundskeeper reported to local newspaper The McDowell Times in 1956 that he sometimes found surgical gauze wrapped around the small stones that marked the borders of the plot, each piece folded with unsettling precision. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports that emerged in the late 1950s, when McDowell County Hospital recorded several cases of patients claiming to have encountered a tall, bearded man walking the hospital corridors late at night. They described him as wearing outdated clothing and carrying what appeared to be medical instruments. When approached, he would reportedly ask directions to the surgical theater in oddly formal language before disappearing around corners or into rooms that turned out to be empty. Hospital administrators attributed these sightings to medication effects or the disorientation common in hospital settings. However, one night, nurse reported finding a perfect anatomical drawing of the human nervous system left at the nurse's station, rendered in an antiquated style reminiscent of 19th century medical texts. The drawing was reportedly filed away and eventually lost during a renovation in 1968. The story of Thomas Alderson has largely faded from official history, preserved mainly through oral tradition and fragmentary documentation. Whether viewed as a cautionary tale about isolation's effects on the human mind or something more fundamentally disturbing about human nature, it remains one of the most unsettling chapters in Appalachian history. What makes the Alderson case particularly remarkable is how it reveals the thin veneer of civilization that existed even among educated professionals of the era. That a respected physician could transform into a predatory figure in the wilderness speaks to the precarious nature of human rationality when removed from social constraints. The few surviving journal fragments suggest that Alderson did not view his actions as murder, but rather as a continuation of legitimate scientific inquiry, unfettered by what he termed moral considerations appropriate to the general public, but unnecessarily limiting to true advancement. This clinical detachment, more than the physical acts themselves, continues to disturb those who study the case. In the decades following these events, Black Wolf Ridge acquired a reputation that kept it largely uninhabited, despite the region's otherwise increasing development. Mining companies acquired the land but conducted only limited operations there, citing practical difficulties rather than acknowledging the unease that permeated any project attempted in the area. The last documented incident connected to the Alderson case occurred in 1968, when a group of geology students from Marshall University camped near the ridge while conducting a summer field study. According to their professor's report, filed with university administrators, but never published, the students abandoned their equipment after the second night and refused to return to the site. They reported finding their surveying tools rearranged in patterns reminiscent of surgical arrays each morning, despite the equipment being secured in their tents overnight. One student reported waking to find a shallow trench dug next to his sleeping bag, approximately the length and width of a human body. Another claimed to have heard someone washing hands in the nearby stream at precisely 3:17 a.m. on both nights, the time documented by his wristwatch. When the professor attempted to investigate these claims himself, he reportedly discovered a collection of rocks arranged to form a crude anatomy chart, with twigs positioned to indicate incision lines. The university discontinued field studies in the area following this incident. The professor's request for further investigation was denied, and the report was filed away without action. This appears to be the last official documentation relating to the strange legacy of Thomas Alderson. While the physical traces of Alderson have largely disappeared, his influence on the collective psychology of the region persisted in subtle ways. Several older mining families in McDowell County developed traditions that appeared directly linked to the Alderson case, though the origins have been obscured with time. One such tradition, documented by folklorists in the 1970s, involves placing small stones in windowsills, specifically 7 stones, the same number as the search party that discovered Alderson's cabin. When asked about this practice, residents typically responded that it was to keep the watcher out, or sometimes to know if someone's been counting. Another regional peculiarity is the reluctance among older generations to use lye soap, despite its practical value in a rural setting. One elderly woman interviewed for an oral history project in 1984 explained, "My grandmother wouldn't have it in the house. Said the smell attracted the wrong kind of attention. Said some things get a taste for cleanliness that goes beyond what's natural." The psychological impact of the Alderson case extended beyond local superstition. Dr. Margaret Holbrook, who practiced psychiatry in McDowell County from 1945 to 1967, noted in her professional papers a recurring motif among patients suffering from anxiety disorders: the fear of being studied or observed by an unseen presence. Holbrook, who was aware of the Alderson history, theorized that the story had become an unconscious archetype in the regional psyche, representing fears of violation and objectification. In her notes, Holbrook wrote, "There exists in this community a particular form of anxiety that I have not encountered elsewhere in my practice. Patients describe a sensation of being regarded not as a person, but as a specimen. not with malice, but with cool detachment, which they find more disturbing. Several have independently described dreams of a bearded man who does not threaten them, but merely takes notes on their movements. This persistent psychological echo may explain why, despite the passage of decades, the Alderson case has never been fully incorporated into the region's marketing of its colorful history. While other local legends and historical figures are celebrated in festivals and tourist attractions, Thomas Alderson remains conspicuously absent from official heritage materials. As one county commissioner told a journalist in 1995, "Some stories don't need telling, some just need forgetting." Yet forgetting proved impossible. In 1978, construction workers expanding the county hospital unearthed a small metal box buried beneath the original foundation stones. The box contained a single journal page preserved in wax paper bearing handwriting identified by an archival expert as consistent with the few known samples of Alderson's script. The page contained no narrative, only a diagram of what appeared to be a modification to a surgical instrument, with the notation, "Applied properly, even the crudest tool can achieve precision. The hand that guides matters more than the instrument itself." How this page came to be buried in the hospital foundation, which had been laid in 1921, nearly 2 decades after Alderson's death, remains unexplained. Hospital administrators downplayed the discovery, and the page was eventually transferred to the State Archives in Charleston, where it was cataloged with minimal information and effectively buried again, this time in bureaucratic obscurity. The Alderson case experienced a brief resurgence of interest in the early 1990s, when true crime literature became increasingly popular. Author Martin Shelby researched the case for a planned book titled The Anatomist of Black Wolf Ridge, but abandoned the project after several months of investigation. In a brief interview with a local newspaper, Shelby explained his decision. "Some cases resist narrative. The more I learned about Alderson, the less I felt I understood him. More troublingly, the more I wrote about him, the more I felt I was somehow continuing his work, this clinical examination of human behavior stripped of its humanity." Shelby's notes, donated to the West Virginia State Historical Society, reveal an intriguing detail not mentioned in earlier accounts. However, his career trajectory changed following a personal tragedy, the death of his wife during childbirth in 1887, a loss that reportedly left him emotionally detached and increasingly focused on what colleagues described as the mechanics of human physiology rather than its treatment. This biographical detail offers a potential psychological explanation for Alderson's descent into methodical depravity, a mind retreating from emotional trauma into extreme rationality, ultimately losing connection with the humanity of his subjects. According to his research, Thomas Alden, before his transformation into Alderson, had been considered a promising medical researcher whose early work on nerve conduction was well regarded. However, as Shelby noted, this explanation feels insufficient when confronted with the calculated nature of Alderson's actions in Appalachia. The impact of the Alderson case extended beyond the immediate region. Medical historian Dr. Eleanor Wright has suggested that the case, though not widely publicized, influenced the development of ethical guidelines in medical research during the early 20th century. In her 2001 paper, Cautionary Narratives in Medical Ethics, Wright notes that several prominent physicians who later advocated for stricter ethical protocols had connections to Jefferson Medical College during the period when the Alderson-Alden case would have been discussed among faculty. Wright writes, "While never explicitly referenced in the literature, the specter of Alden appears to hover behind some of the more emphatic arguments for ethical restraint in medical research during this period. The fear that unregulated inquiry could transform the healer into something monstrous is a recurring theme in these early ethics discussions. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Alderson case is how it transformed the relationship between the people of McDowell County and their surrounding wilderness. The Appalachian Mountains have always represented a complex symbol to those who dwell in their shadows, a source of sustenance and identity, but also of danger and isolation. The Alderson story added another dimension, the mountains as a place where civilization itself could unravel, where human nature might be revealed in its most disturbing form. This psychological relationship manifested in subtle cultural patterns that persisted for generations. Local hunting guides developed elaborate protocols for expeditions into certain areas, including rules about maintaining visual contact with companions and prohibitions against separation, even for brief periods. Hunters who normally prided themselves on self-reliance became unusually insistent on the virtue of companionship in the deep woods. A local saying emerged, "The mountains see you before you see them." On its surface, this referred to the way ridgelines become visible from a distance, while the observer remains unseen from the heights. But the phrase carried a deeper implication for those familiar with the Alderson story, a warning about unseen observation, about being studied by forces beyond one's awareness. The town of Welch itself was shaped by the subconscious influence of the Alderson case. Unlike many Appalachian communities that spread organically along valleys, Welch developed with an unusual emphasis on visibility and surveillance. Architectural historians have noted the prevalence of windows positioned to overlook public spaces and the relative scarcity of secluded areas within the town design. Local building ordinances, established in 1910 and maintained for decades, specifically prohibited certain features that might create concealed spaces or obstruct sightlines between properties. Even today, residents of McDowell County sometimes display behaviors that can be traced to the psychological legacy of the Alderson case. Sociologist Dr. James Farrell, who conducted field research in the region in the early 2000s, observed that older residents maintained unusual attention to personal boundaries and physical space. In social settings, they positioned themselves to maintain clear sightlines to entrances and exits, and exhibited discomfort when observed without their awareness. Farrell wrote, "There exists in this community a heightened sensitivity to observation that manifests in subtle but consistent behaviors. Older residents, in particular, demonstrate what might be called preemptive observation, a tendency to position themselves to see before being seen and to establish visual control of shared spaces. When asked about these habits, most subjects cannot articulate their origin, but describe them as just how we do things here." This persistent wariness, this attention to being watched, represents perhaps the most tangible legacy of Thomas Alderson, a man who observed others not with malice but with something more disturbing, clinical detachment. The fear he instilled was not of violence itself, but of being reduced to an object of study, stripped of humanity, and examined with cold precision. The historical record offers a final, unsettling footnote to the Alderson case. In 1952, during renovations to the old courthouse in Welch, workers discovered a sealed envelope hidden within a wall cavity. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper bearing what appeared to be a portion of a letter, though the recipient was not indicated. The handwriting matched known samples of Sheriff Coleman's script. The fragment read, "Cannot shake the conviction that we erred in our haste. What we found was abhorrent, yes, but I am increasingly troubled by what we did not find." The journals made reference to storage areas beyond the cabin, yet we located no such places. The remains discovered were insufficient for the number of disappearances recorded. I fear we may have ended the man without ending his work. More disturbing still is the thought that perhaps Alderson himself was merely a component of something larger. His journals spoke of correspondence, of shared research. What if he was not alone in his pursuits? What if the fragment ended there? No evidence has ever emerged to substantiate Coleman's apparent concerns about accomplices or additional victims. Most historians consider it the anxious speculation of a man traumatized by his experience. Yet the letter raises a haunting possibility that the story of Thomas Alderson, disturbing as it is, represents only a visible portion of a darker, more extensive narrative that remains hidden within the ancient folds of the Appalachian Mountains. For those who know the region intimately, this uncertainty adds another layer to their relationship with the landscape. The mountains hold many secrets: coal seams and crystal formations, underground streams, and forgotten trails. But they may also hold darker knowledge, fragments of human depravity preserved like fossils in the layers of history that compose this ancient place. In his brief response to the historian who contacted him in 1940, Miller wrote, "Some things must not be remembered." But his full reply, obtained by Professor Thornton during his research, continued with a more ambiguous observation. Yet they remember themselves, with or without our permission. This cryptic statement encapsulates the enduring power of the Alderson case, a story that resists forgetting, that continues to echo through the hollows and ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. The final word on Thomas Alderson may have come from Joseph Miller, the guide who first led the surveyors to Black Wolf Ridge, and the sole survivor of the search party. Like the sound of hands being methodically washed in a mountain stream, it persists just at the edge of hearing, a reminder that some boundaries, once crossed, can never be fully restored. Dr. Phillips's journals, discovered after his death in 1918, contain several entries that shed additional light on Thomas Alderson's character and methods. In one passage, dated April 1903, Phillips described a chance encounter with Alderson in the woods near Welch. "Came upon A today while gathering herbs for my medicinal stores. He was dissecting a large buck with remarkable precision, using tools that appeared to be modified surgical instruments. When I commented on his technique, he replied, 'The anatomy remains consistent across species, only the scale changes.' There was something in his tone that caused me to cut our conversation short and continue on my way." Another entry, dated August 1904, just 2 months before the surveyor's disappearance, noted, "A visited my office today, ostensibly to inquire about obtaining ether or chloroform for a dental condition. When I offered to examine him, he declined, stating he preferred to self-administer. I refused his request, citing regulations. As he left, he remarked, 'Pain is merely information. The body's warning system can be educated to serve different purposes.' The statement has lingered in my mind, though I cannot articulate why it troubles me so." These observations suggest that Alderson's disturbing practices had been visible to the community in subtle ways long before the events of October 1904. In retrospect, certain behaviors that had been dismissed as mere eccentricity revealed themselves as warning signs. His unusual interest in anatomy, his clinical detachment, his preoccupation with cleanliness, that now seemed less about hygiene and more about removing evidence. The county archives contained scattered reports that acquired new significance after Alderson's true nature was revealed. Between 1898 and 1904, approximately 14 men were reported missing in the vicinity of Black Wolf Ridge, an unusually high number even for the dangerous terrain of Appalachia. Most cases were explained away as mining accidents, encounters with wild animals, or simply men abandoning their responsibilities and moving on to new territories. After the Alderson case, these disappearances were re-examined, though conclusive evidence linking them to Alderson was never found. One particularly haunting account came from a trapper named Edwin Moss, who in 1901 reported a strange encounter to the sheriff's office. While checking his traps near Black Wolf Ridge, Moss claimed to have discovered a small cave entrance partially concealed by brush. Curious, he had investigated and found what he described as a room of sorts with shelves carved into the rock walls. On these shelves were arranged various bones that Moss initially took to be animal remains. What disturbed him enough to report the finding was the discovery of what appeared to be human teeth among the collection. When a deputy accompanied Moss back to the site 3 days later, they were unable to locate the cave entrance. The report was filed and forgotten until after Alderson's death, when it was retrieved as part of the broader investigation. The physical evidence from the case has largely disappeared over time. The few items that were preserved as evidence in the county courthouse were destroyed in a fire in 1943 that consumed much of the building's east wing. According to inventory records, these items had included Alderson's journal covers, the contents having been burned in 1904, several modified surgical tools, and a collection of sketches found in a hidden compartment beneath the cabin floor. The sketches reportedly depicted human anatomical structures with annotations in Alderson's precise handwriting. One item that survived, currently held in the West Virginia State Museum's restricted collection, is a small brass case containing what appear to be custom-made scalpels of unusual design. The case bears the inscription TA in flowing script. According to museum records, the case was donated anonymously in 1967 with a note stating only that it had been found in a wall cavity during demolition of an old dwelling in McDowell County. The museum curator who cataloged the item noted that the scalpels showed evidence of extensive use and subsequent meticulous cleaning. The psychological impact of the Alderson case extended to those who merely heard about it secondhand. In the decades following the events, numerous residents of McDowell County reported recurring nightmares featuring a tall, bearded figure who observed them with clinical detachment. A folk belief emerged that speaking Alderson's name after dark would summon his presence, not as a vengeful spirit, but as a dispassionate observer who would take notes on your sleeping form. Parents used this legend to encourage their young adults to return home before nightfall, warning that the mountain doctor makes his rounds after dark. The topography of Black Wolf Ridge itself seems to have contributed to the unsettling nature of the Alderson legend. The ridge features unusual acoustic properties, with certain rock formations creating natural amplification effects. Sound carries strangely through the hollows, sometimes projecting whispers across surprising distances or creating echoes that seem to originate from unexpected directions. Local guides warned visitors about the Whispering Rocks, where one might hear conversations from unseen speakers or the sound of water when no stream was present. In 1955, geologist Dr. Harold Simmons conducted a survey of the ridge for the U.S. Geological Survey. His field notes, preserved in the National Archives, include an unusual personal observation, spent night at North Slope Camp. Approximately a.m., awakened by sound of water splashing as if someone washing hands in nearby stream. Stream located 50-plus yards from camp. Sound unusually distinct despite distance. Duration, approximately 3 minutes. No visual confirmation of source. Similar phenomenon reported by assistant on previous night. Possible explanation, wind patterns creating acoustic anomaly. Alternative, local legends affecting perception, suggestibility. Recommend objective measurement in future surveys. No such measurements were ever conducted, as funding for the survey was redirected to other projects. Simmons's brief mention represents one of the few attempts to apply scientific methodology to the persistent reports of unusual phenomena associated with the ridge. The cultural impact of the Alderson case extended into various aspects of regional life, often in ways that the residents themselves did not consciously recognize. Folklorist Dr. Amanda Reichman, who studied Appalachian customs in the 1980s, identified several practices specific to McDowell County that appeared to have originated from the Alderson incident. Among these was the tradition of washing away the watcher, a ritual cleaning of doorways and window frames with clear water, never with soap, during the spring cleaning. When asked about the purpose of this practice, most residents offered practical explanations about removing winter grime, but a few older individuals mentioned that it was to clear away unwanted attention or to wash away eyes that shouldn't be looking. Another custom documented by Reichman but now largely abandoned involved the preparation of hunting equipment. Hunters from the region surrounding Black Wolf Ridge would place their rifles, knives, and traps in a specific arrangement before a hunting expedition, supposedly to ensure good luck. The pattern, when diagrammed by Reichman, bore a striking resemblance to a surgical array, though none of the hunters interviewed made this connection explicitly or seemed aware of its significance. The story of Thomas Alderson entered the realm of formal literature in 1957, when regional author Clarence Harmon published a collection of short stories titled Shadows in the Hollows. One story, The Man Who Watched, featured a character clearly based on Alderson, though Harmon denied any direct connection and claimed the story was entirely fictional. The tale described a reclusive figure in the mountains who observed travelers with the keen interest of a naturalist regarding specimens. The story ended with the disturbing revelation that the watcher had constructed a network of hidden viewing ports throughout the mountains, allowing him to study the movements of every person who entered his territory. Harmon's story received little attention outside Appalachia, but locally it was met with a complicated response. The book sold well initially, but many residents refused to keep it in their homes, often returning purchased copies to the bookstore in Welch. The owner reported that customers frequently commented that having the book felt like inviting observation or putting out a welcome mat for the watcher. The story's popularity waned quickly, and the book went out of print after a single printing of 500 copies. In 1960, the same year that Professor Thornton began his investigation, the McDowell County Historical Society attempted to organize an exhibit on local folklore that would have included a small section on the Alderson case. The exhibit never materialized, as community opposition was immediate and resolute. The Society's minutes record that several prominent citizens objected on the grounds that some matters are best left to fade from memory, and that certain stories, once given attention, tend to grow rather than diminish. The proposal was withdrawn, and no subsequent attempt to publicly document the case was made until the 1990s. The terrain of Black Wolf Ridge itself underwent significant changes during the mid-20th century. In addition to logging operations that cleared much of the original forest, strip mining altered the contours of the land, particularly on the southern slopes. The crevice where the surveyor's belongings had been found was presumably destroyed during these operations, though its exact location had never been precisely documented. The fire pit discovered by the search party likewise disappeared beneath industrial development. Yet, despite these physical alterations, certain areas of the ridge remained untouched. Mining company records indicate that operations on the northern slope were abandoned prematurely due to equipment failures and personnel issues. One internal memo, dated 1958, notes, "Workers refused to remain on site after dusk. Repeated incidents of sabotage to equipment. Recommend relocation of operations to South Face, where productivity has been consistent. North Slope investment to be written off as loss." The specific nature of these incidents was never officially documented, but oral accounts from former miners suggest a pattern of unsettling experiences. Equipment would be found rearranged overnight, despite security measures. Personal belongings would disappear from locked cabins, only to be discovered days later arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. Several workers reported finding small anatomical diagrams carved into trees near the work sites, crude representations of the human nervous system or circulatory pathways. The most detailed account came from Foreman Harold Jenkins, who supervised operations on the North Slope in 1957. In an interview conducted by a local newspaper in 1975, Jenkins described the final incident that led to the abandonment of the site. "We'd been having trouble for weeks, tools missing, men refusing to work certain areas, that sort of thing. But the last straw came when we broke through into what looked like some kind of cave or tunnel during a blasting operation. Before we could properly examine it, there was a partial collapse that sealed it back up." That same night, every man in camp reported the same dream: a tall man with a beard walking through the camp, touching each sleeping worker's forehead with fingers that left wet marks, like he'd been washing his hands. By morning, half the crew had packed up and left. We shut down operations the next day. Geological surveys conducted in the 1970s indicated the presence of an extensive cave system beneath Black Wolf Ridge, though no comprehensive exploration was ever undertaken. A 1978 proposal by the National Speleological Society to map the caves was denied permits by both state authorities and the mining companies that owned mineral rights to the area. The official reason given was concern about structural stability, but internal communications suggest a reluctance to draw attention to the area due to its problematic history and persistent local superstitions. The absence of children in the Alderson narrative stands out as unusual for rural folklore, which typically incorporates warnings to the young as a primary function. This absence has been interpreted by some scholars as evidence of the story's basis in actual events rather than imaginative elaboration. Dr. Margaret Holbrook, in her psychiatric analysis, suggested that the Alderson case represented a purely adult horror, the fear not of supernatural threats but of human nature itself when unmoored from social constraints. The most recent documented reference to Thomas Alderson comes from an unexpected source: the official report of a forest fire that swept across portions of Black Wolf Ridge in the summer of 1997. Fire crews reported difficulty containing the blaze due to unusual wind patterns that seemed to protect certain areas while directing flames toward others. The fire ultimately burned approximately 60% of the ridge before being extinguished by seasonal rains. In the aftermath, survey teams assessed the environmental impact and documented an unusual phenomenon: a perfect circle of unburned forest, approximately 100 yards in diameter, centered on what appeared to be the remains of a stone foundation. According to the report, this foundation was consistent with the dimensions of a small cabin and was positioned in a location that matches historical descriptions of the Alderson dwelling, though positive identification is impossible due to the absence of definitive records. The survey team noted that the unburned circle could be explained by natural fire breaks, such as a change in vegetation or soil moisture. However, the report includes a personal observation from team leader Robert Carson. While scientific explanations exist for the preservation of this site, I feel compelled to note the unsettling precision of the unburned perimeter and the fact that no natural fire break is readily apparent. The team experienced unanimous discomfort while documenting this location and completed our work with unusual haste. I make this note not as an official observation, but as a matter of record. The foundation was photographed and mapped but not excavated, as the survey team's mandate did not include archaeological investigation. The photographs included in the report show a simple rectangular outline of weathered stones partially reclaimed by forest growth. Of particular note is one image that captured what appears to be a small object protruding from the earth near the foundation's northwest corner. Though blurry in the photograph, it has been identified by some as potentially being the handle of a medical instrument, though this interpretation remains speculative. The forested area of Black Wolf Ridge was designated a wilderness preserve in 2005, ostensibly for environmental protection. Public access is limited to marked trails that notably avoid the northern slope where Alderson's cabin was believed to have stood. Park ranger logs include occasional reports of hikers experiencing disorientation or unusual acoustic phenomena, but no official investigation of these reports has been conducted. The psychological impact of the Alderson case continues to manifest in subtle ways throughout McDowell County. In 2010, sociologist Dr. James Farrell returned to the region to conduct follow-up research on his earlier observations. He found that many of the behavioral patterns he had documented in the early 2000s had persisted, particularly among families with deep roots in the area. These included the tendency toward preemptive observation and an unusual emphasis on clear sight lines in both public and private spaces. Farrell also documented a new phenomenon: the use of digital technology to create what he termed observation networks. informal systems of surveillance using security cameras and social media to maintain awareness of community movements. While such networks have become common in many rural areas concerned with crime prevention, Farrell noted that in McDowell County the emphasis seemed to be less on identifying potential threats and more on maintaining a comprehensive awareness of who is watching whom. In interviews conducted as part of this research, Farrell found that older residents continued to express discomfort with certain locations associated with the Alderson case, particularly Black Wolf Ridge itself. When asked why they avoided these areas, most provided practical explanations related to rough terrain or lack of interesting features. However, when pressed further, several admitted to a sense of being studied or feeling like a specimen when in proximity to the ridge. One elderly respondent told Farrell, "It's not that I think he's still up there. It's that I think whatever made him what he was might still be there, waiting for someone else to find it." This response highlights a key aspect of the Alderson legacy, the fear not of a supernatural presence, but of a natural process, a transformation that could potentially occur in anyone under the right circumstances. The horror of Thomas Alderson lay not in monstrous actions alone, but in the suggestion that a respected professional, a man of science and healing, could become something inhuman while retaining his human form and rational mind. The final mystery of the Alderson case may be the most disturbing, the question of his legacy beyond the grave. Historical records indicate that Alderson had no known family or personal connections in the region. Yet several residents interviewed by Professor Thornton in 1962 mentioned rumors of Alderson having students or correspondents, individuals who shared his interests and may have continued his work after his death. No concrete evidence of such followers has ever emerged, but the persistence of the rumor itself is noteworthy. It suggests a fear that Alderson's approach to human observation, clinical, detached, devoid of empathy, might be transmissible, like a contagion of perspective. This fear manifests in the reluctance of local residents to discuss the case in detail, as if speaking about Alderson might somehow invite his way of seeing into one's own mind. In this sense, Thomas Alderson represents a uniquely modern horror, not the supernatural threat of traditional folklore, but the horror of detachment, of rationality divorced from morality, of observation without empathy. His legacy lives not in ghost stories, but in the subtle vigilance of a community that learned through terrible experience that the most dangerous predator is the one who sees humans not as people, but as fascinating specimens worthy of study. So when you find yourself on a mountain trail as evening approaches and the shadows lengthen among the trees and you hear the sound of water that might be a stream or might be someone methodically washing their hands, remember the story of Thomas Alderson, who was thought harmless until they found what he'd done. And perhaps, like the people of McDowell County, you'll find yourself listening more carefully to the silence of the wilderness, alert for the sound of hands being meticulously washed clean, though the stains they carried were never visible to begin with. The mountains are watching. They have always been watching. And sometimes they take notes on what they see.